Hi everyone, my name is Jess and I am the founder of Sallie Tomato. We were inspired by Missouri Star's So Many Squares pattern to create a really fun patchwork charade bag. Not only is this design perfect for coordinating fabrics, but it's also a great scrap buster. Today we will be making the crossbody size of the charade bag pattern, and we have a template to work off of for the size of our quilt block. You can even use this tutorial for other bag patterns to create your own patchwork bag, or even the tote bag size of the charade bag, which is a little bit larger and wider. So go ahead and gather some scraps or coordinating fabrics that you would like to feature on your patchwork bag, and let's get started with the tutorial. We were inspired by the Missouri Star So Many Squares pattern to create a really fun patchwork charade bag. Not only is this design fun for coordinating fabrics, but it is also a perfect scrap buster. So we will be making the crossbody size of the charade, and we have a template to work off of for sizing our pieced area. So the first step is deciding which fabrics you would like to use for your project. We chose 5 prints from the Bloomberry collection by Minky Kim from Riley Blake. Next, we'll need to determine the size quilt block that we need to create. So here I have my main panel piece for the charade crossbody bag. So looking at the height of the pattern piece, we'll want to make sure that our quilt block is at least 12.5 inches high. However, it is nice to create a little bit larger quilt block, so that way you can position the template within the block, so all of the rows and columns of the blocks are perfectly aligned in the center. So I might aim for a 14-inch high block, and then if we flip our pattern piece over, the width of our pattern piece is about 11 inches. So we could make the block at least 12 inches wide. Otherwise, to make it a little bit easier for piecing our blocks together, we could aim to create a block that is 14 by 14 inches square, and then it's easier to position and decide the final placement of our pattern template. So I'm going to set this aside and begin laying out my blocks in the order that I would like them. I'm going to try to be as random as possible because that is the look I am going for. So I'm just going to continue to just randomly grab some of my scraps. And you want to make sure that you account for seam allowance. So as I'm laying these blocks out, these are 2.5-inch square blocks. These first 5 blocks are not going to be wide enough for my 14-inch quilt block, so I'm going to add on 6 across, which means I'll also need to add 6 high. So I think this turned out pretty well for my first attempt at laying out the pieces randomly. Whenever I create a randomly pieced quilt block, I do a final look over by checking to see where each of the fabrics are. So with these fabrics that I chose, it's really easy to pick out the colors from each of the prints. So first of all, I'll look at the yellows to make sure that they are randomly placed. Then I'll look at the oranges. Those all look really random. The greens look great, the blues, and as well as the reds and the oranges. So everything looks really, really good. Sometimes my eyes scan across from the top down and then from the sides, and I just double check each color more than once to make sure that I'm happy with it. And if needed, some of the fabrics can shift as well and be swapped. So take your time playing around with the placement of your fabrics. Remember that the center of your bag will be the focal point here. Another final check before we start piecing is to just align your pattern piece in the center and see if you like the placement of the blocks that will be in the center, and then also along the outer edges. So I'm going to collect the leftover squares. This will be for the back panel of the bag. We'll work on the front panel first. Now we're ready for assembly of the block. We will assemble the pieces in rows and then nest the seams to help reduce bulk. So I'm going to start with the row closest to me and pick 2 blocks that are close together and place the fabrics right sides together, and over at the machine we're going to sew the pieces with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have my machine set to a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. Then I'll repeat to attach all of the blocks together for the first row. Now that our first row is stitched, now is a great time to double check that our pieced row will accommodate the width of our pattern template. At this point, you can take your row over to your ironing board and press all of the seam allowances in one direction. However, I'm going to wait to press each of my rows because I'm using a wool pressing mat and I'm limited on space. So I'm going to continue to assemble my rows and then press at the end. Now, before I piece together the rows, I'm going to take my pressing mat and my iron, and you can choose to either press the seams open or all in one direction. So the first row, I am going to press, I'm going to press all the seams towards the left. So that way, my seams for each row are going to be pressed in opposite directions. So now the next one will be pressed towards the left. Then the right, and so on. Can set the pressing mat aside. And now we're going to piece together our rows. So I'm going to start with 2 rows, place them right sides together. And it's very important that you align the seam allowances. So the seams, as you can see, will be nesting together, which means the seam allowance on opposite sides of each of the rows is going in the opposite direction. I'm going to grab my sewing clips to make sure that those seam allowances stay aligned. I'm going to add a clip at each of those seams. And if you notice that they're not quite lining up, usually you can ease the fabric towards one side or the other to allow them to fit. And then we'll sew the row together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as you approach one of the nested seams, just stop, remove the clip, and make sure that the seam underneath doesn't get flipped in the opposite direction. So just double check everything is flat and glide it through the machine. So I am going to press the row seam allowances as I go to be a little bit easier to manage. And you certainly could press the seam allowance towards one side or the other, wherever it tends to lay flat works. Otherwise, you can press the seam allowance open to ensure that you're dispersing that bulk evenly. One of the key steps during the bag making process is dispersing bulk or reducing bulk wherever possible. So I like to press the row seam allowance open for the flattest possible option. It's so fun to see it come together so quickly. And now we'll continue and repeat attaching each of the rows. And certainly you can continue to clip and make sure that those seam allowances stay aligned. However, I'm going to align as I sew. And since I'm primarily a bag maker, I do love to quilt. So having the opportunity to quilt is very fun and exciting for me. However, if you are an avid quilter and you see me piecing this block together and you have another method of piecing and pressing that's tried and true, of course, feel free to use your own technique. You'll still get a beautiful quilt block when you're done. So I'm gonna flip the completed block over and give it a final press from the right side. And here's how the finished block turned out. So I noticed somewhere along the way I must have accidentally flipped either two of the pieces or the entire row, but hey, it still turned out cute. And with these repeating blocks, we could even turn the piece so that way it gets turned toward the bottom edge of the bag, or perhaps that'll even get cut off once we position our template. So before we move on to the next step, I'm going to take my Charade template and make sure that the pattern piece fits on the quilt block. And we are so close to the edges, but we made it. This is a big enough block, so all we had to do was piece together 6 rows across the top and down the bottom. Because we added an even number of blocks, it's really convenient because we have 3 columns on this side and 3 columns on the right hand side, so that way we know the center of our panel will be the center seam allowance of the block. So I do have a couple additional tips that if you decide to make the tote bag size of the Charade pattern, or perhaps you're using this technique for another bag pattern, just remember that if you're working with directional prints, you'll have to pay close attention to which row will be the top edge of your bag and which will be the bottom. So when you create your initial layout of your blocks, just make sure that the print is going in the correct direction that you want it. The most important part about incorporating a quilt block or applique or embroidery into a bag pattern is ensuring that it is placed properly according to the measurements or the pattern templates. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to mark the vertical and horizontal centers, both on your quilt block as well as on your template. So it's easy with this pattern piece, since it is supposed to be cut on the fold, that we know our top and bottom center. To find the horizontal center, we can simply fold our pattern piece in half, making sure that the sides and the top and bottom edges are aligned. And I'm just going to align the pattern piece on my cutting mat so that way I can easily see where the bottom edge and the top edge meet. I'll just fold that in half. So we can reference that fold line, or even take our ruler and a pen to mark each of those horizontal center marks. And again, our quilt block worked out perfectly because we have an even number of blocks on both sides of each of our center marks. Once you have your block completely assembled and you've double checked that it is the proper size for your pattern template or pattern pieces, you will want to add interfacing to the wrong side of your block to provide additional structure and ensure that you have no thread or fabric fraying issues. We recommend Pellon SF101, Bosal Fashion Fuse, or any lightweight fusible interfacing works perfect for this step. So once you fuse your interfacing to the wrong side, you'll take your pattern piece and align the center marks. Then you can take any marking pen. It can even be a permanent pen if that's easiest to see, because next you'll want to mark the outer edges of the template. And if you use a permanent pen, that is okay, because all of these raw edges are going to get sewn into the seam allowances. So here I just have my erasable fabric marker, which might be a little difficult to see on the darker fabrics. So if you have a white chalk, you could use that on the darker fabrics so that way you can easily see the outline. But what I recommend doing is completely tracing all outer edges of the fabric template, then flip your template over and trace all of the outer edges once more to make sure that your centers stay even and aligned, versus folding your block in half and cutting on the fold. I would not recommend this because that could cause your seam allowances to shift underneath, and it's worth the time to take the extra step of marking before cutting. Then you can see your complete outline of your pattern piece and take your scissors and cut along the outer edges. Then at this point of the project, you are ready to switch over to the Charade pattern instructions and follow along. The instructions do include tips for quilting as desired if you would like. So from here, you will gather the rest of the supplies you need to finish your Charade bag. I hope you enjoyed learning how to prep your project to create your very own quilted Charade bag. We have included a step-by-step full-length video tutorial on how to complete your Charade bag at the end of this video. I absolutely adore how this Charade bag turned out, and I cannot wait to see your completed project as well. Be sure to use the hashtag MSQC Show and Tell, hashtag Sallie Tomato, and hashtag Charade bag when you share your photos on social media so we can see your completed project. And if you liked today's tutorial, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more video tutorials. And for more bag making inspiration and tutorials, be sure to check out the rest of our Missouri Star and Sallie Tomato collaborations. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.